In this video, we're going to be talking about the isBalanced method, which will return true when the delimiters are balanced and returns false otherwise. So this is satisfied by two conditions. When you're traversing this array list that we're being passed in that contains all the delimiters, from the first element to the last element, there's no point at which there are more closed delimiters than open delimiters. And then also the total number of open delimiters is equal to the total number of closed delimiters. So let's go ahead and write some pseudocode to get us going. We're probably going to want to keep track of the number of open and the number of closed delimiters that we have seen so far. So create a variable to hold number of open delimiters, and then also create a variable to hold number of closed delimiters. We need a variable for each of these because we're going to be comparing the two to make sure that our array list is balanced. Then we're going to want to actually loop over this array list, and we're going to want to loop over the delimiters array list. Inside of that loop, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to check to see if the current delimiter that we're looking at is an open or a closed delimiter. If the delimiter is an open delimiter, increment the open variable. If the delimiter is a closed delimiter, increment the close variable. Why do we need to keep track of these two values? Well, we're going to be comparing them. So if the number of closed delimiters is greater number of open delimiters, return false. This would not satisfy the first condition. So there should never be more closed delimiters than open delimiters. So if our first token was an open delimiter and then our second one was a closed delimiter, that would be good. But then if our third element was a closed delimiter, now we have 2 versus 1, so we wouldn't be satisfying that condition. Otherwise, we're going to be returning false. Outside of this loop, you might think that we're done, but we also need to satisfy that second condition. We need to make sure that the total number of open delimiters is equal to the total number of closed delimiters. So determine if number of open delimiters is equal to number of closed delimiters. Return true if so, false otherwise. And that should about do it for our pseudocode. So let's go ahead and jump into the implementation. So we need to create a variable to hold the number of open delimiters. This seems like a really good candidate for an int. So int num open. We're going to set this equal to 0 because outside of this for loop, so far we haven't seen any open delimiters, so 0 is a good starting point. And we're going to do the same thing for our close delimiter variable. So then we want to loop over the delimiters. So we have an array list here. So for int I equals 0, we want to start at the first element in our array list. I is less than delimiters dot size. Remember, you have to call that method on an array list. Then we do I++. Okay, and then inside of our for loop, we need to do a few things. We need to determine if the delimiter is an open delimiter. So that is going to look like if, first let's grab our delimiter. So it's going to be a string because it's an array list of strings, delimiter.getI. So we've got our delimiter. If it's an open delimiter, so if delimiter.equals open del, where open del is that field that we have inside of our class, and we're using .equals because it's string comparison. If it is an open delimiter, we're gonna say, okay, we found a open delimiter, so we can increment our num open variable. Otherwise, if it's a delimiter.equals a closed delimiter, we will be incrementing the close variable. So num close plus plus. It's going to be one of the two because we know that this is just delimiters. Then we need to check if the number of closed delimiters is greater than the number of open delimiters. So at this point, if we've seen more closed delimiters than open delimiters, we can return early. We can return false. Otherwise, we can keep going with our for loop. So if num close is greater than num open, return false. Okay, and that should be it for our for loop. So once we exit our for loop, we have determined the first condition, that from the first element to the last element, there was no point at which there were more closed delimiters than open delimiters at or before that point. Outside of the for loop, however, we still need to determine that the second condition is true, that the total number of open delimiters is equal to the total number of closed delimiters. So if num open is equal to num close, we can return true. Otherwise, we can return false. There's a way to simplify this if you are looking closely. So notice that this is going to return a Boolean. So we don't actually even need this if-else structure. We can just return num close is equal to, or num open is equal to num close. You can do something like that. It'll simplify the code a little bit. You can do it with the if-else structure if that makes you feel better, but I prefer this. And that should be it for our code. So let's go ahead and test it out with these examples that the problem provides us. So we have this initial array list. It's got 6 elements inside of it. We're going to initialize num open and num close to be 0. We're going to loop through all of the elements inside of delimiters. So 0 is less than 6. That's true. So we get the delimiter at the very first index, which is sup. Does it equal the open delimiter? Yes, it does, because we have determined that our open delimiter is sup. So we increment num open, so this is now equal to 1. We skip over this logic. We check if num close is greater than num open. So at this point, we check is 0 greater than 1? No, it is not. So we do not return false. We continue our loop. The next element is also a sup with open brackets, so we increment our num open. Is 0 greater than 2? No, it is not. We move on to the next element, which is going to be the closed delimiter. So now we can finally increment. Is num close greater than num open? Is 1 greater than 2? No, it is not. We look at the very next element, which is another open delimiter. We increment that. Is 1 greater than 3? No, it is not. Move on to the next element, which is a closed delimiter. Increment num close. Is 2 greater than 3? No, it is not. We move on to the next 5. The last element in the array list is this closed delimiter. So we see num close is equal to 3. Is 3 greater than 3? No, it is not. We increment I again. We've run out of elements in our array. We exit the for loop, and now we check whether num open is equal to num close. So is 3 equal to 3? Yes, it is. So this array list would return balanced. Then if we look at the second example, we have now only 4 elements in our array. We initialize num open, num close to 0. We see is 0 less than 4? Yes, it is. We get the first delimiter, which is an open delimiter. So we set num open to 1. Num close is still 0. Is 0 greater than 1? No, it is not. Next element in our array list, which is a closed delimiter. So now num close is 1. Is 1 greater than 1? No, it is not. We move on to the next element, which is another closed delimiter. So now num close is 2. This is where things get a little bad. Num close is now greater than num open, so we're going to be returning false because this example does not satisfy that first condition where from the first element to the last element, there's no point at which there are more closed delimiters than open delimiters. So at this point in our array list, we have 2 closed delimiters when we only have 1. So we're going to be returning false here, unfortunately. The next array list we're looking at just has this closed delimiter inside of it. So num open and num close, setting it to 0. Is 0 less than 1? Yes. So we look at that one element inside of our delimiters array. It's going to be this. It's going to be the closed delimiter. So we're going to set num close equal to 1. At this point, num open is only 0. So 1 is greater than 0. So we have, once again, not satisfied that first condition. So we're going to return false for this array list. It is not balanced. And then if we look at our final example, we have something that looks like that. So we have 3 elements inside of our for loop. The first element is this open delimiter. So we set our open delimiter to 1. Is 0 greater than 1? No, it is not. We look at the next element, which is another open delimiter. We set num open equal to 2. Is 0 greater than 2? No, it is not. We look at our final element in our array. This is a closed delimiter, so we increment num close to be 1. Is 1 greater than 2? No, it is not. We do not return false. We try to increment this again. 3 is not less than 3. So we exit our for loop. And now we need to determine whether num close is equal to num open. Unfortunately, it is not. So this is another example of an array list that is not balanced, because the number of close delimiters, 1, is not equal to the number of open delimiters, which is 2. If we get rid of our pseudocode, here is what our isBalanced method looks like, where we have these 2 variables keeping track of the number of open delimiters and number of closed delimiters. We're looping over our array list. We're grabbing the delimiter. We're comparing if it's an open or a closed delimiter and incrementing its respective variable. If at that point the number of closed delimiters we've encountered is greater than the number of open, we're returning early, we're returning false. Once we get out of that for loop, we determine if the number of open delimiters we saw was equal to the number of closed delimiters, returning true if so, false otherwise. That's about it for this method. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments and I'll get back to you. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.